It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, everybody. I am Jeff Arbuckle, and this, of course, is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. This week, I'm going to be breaking down The War of the Gargantuas, which was a Toho film in 1966, directed by Godzilla's creator, Ishiro Honda. This was the third of three co-productions between Toho in Japan and a producer by the name of Henry G. Saperstein, or Saperstein. He was the head of United Productions of America, and this one, along with the other productions that they kind of did together during the mid-60s, usually featured a single American star, or quote-unquote star, and basically the rest of the cast being Japanese and taking place in Japan and featuring all of the typical production value of a kaiju movie. Now, the star of this film was Russ Tamblyn. Now, Russ Tamblyn was a little bit of a star in the 50s. He was in movies like West Side Story, The Haunting, Peyton Place, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. Later on, he would show up in Twin Peaks. It's kind of interesting because there's a lot of stories behind the production of this that kind of carried on that Ishiro Honda was not getting his Toho contract extended or re-signed or anything like that. He was having a little bit of problem behind the scenes there. I mean, he did end up doing more stuff for Toho, but it was kind of almost like a one-off basis, it made it sound like. However, he may have eventually gotten a new contract, but he also struggled mightily with Russ Tamblyn, and one of his assistants said that Honda really did a good job of holding his tongue, but that he did say in these exact words that Tamblyn was pretty much a huge asshole on the set. Now, I don't know if that was just because he was treated or wanted to be treated like this superstar. I would argue that maybe his stardom had kind of faded a little bit by the time that this movie was made for 1966. But whatever the case is, it was well known that Honda and Tamblyn did not get along. Honda would direct Tamblyn to do or say things a certain way. He would do the opposite. Tamblyn hated the dialogue, so he basically improvised the entire everything he said in this movie. There are times where it kind of feels like it too. But what came out of this is a bit of a cult classic. This is a movie that a lot of relatively big-time directors like Quentin Tarantino, Tim Burton, and Guillermo del Toro all have said that this was a huge this is something that they hugely admire. Even Brad Pitt labels this as a movie that he admires a great deal of. And I think I know why. And we'll get into that when we get to my the three likes that I have about this movie. But I should also admit that this movie is actually technically a sequel. Now, I don't typically do movies that have sequels. I don't typically do the originals before this or after the sequels. I don't normally start with the sequels. This is a little bit different. The year before, there was a movie called Frankenstein Conquers the World, which was also known as Frankenstein versus Baragon. Now, Baragon would go on to be in some Godzilla movies later on. However, there was a real obsession with Frankenstein in the Japanese kaiju movies. I had mentioned this relatively briefly or to a certain extent in the Godzilla or the King Kong versus Godzilla original movie back in 1962, how King Kong originally was supposed to be Frankenstein, that there was some leftover elements to that movie that really does point all signs to it being Frankenstein's monster in that movie. But I wonder if by the 60s or maybe by the end of the 50s or something, there was the original Universal movies, or possibly the Hammer Frankenstein movies, had gotten imported to Japan, and it kind of created this real kind of obsession with the creature. It's a mighty fine creature to be obsessed with. I'm not arguing about that, but it's really funny that there is a great deal of linking to the Frankenstein monster in a couple of these Godzilla and Toho movies. But Toho kind of would do these types of sequels that would be only tangentially connected to another movie. King Kong Escapes, which came out in the late 60s, was a sort of sequel to Godzilla, or King Kong versus Godzilla. It at least takes into consideration the concept that, yes, there is a King Kong roaming around in Japan, but it's how much of it is really connected at all to the previous film? Very little. This movie doesn't exist without the previous movie, Frankenstein Conquers the World, but it also really doesn't owe much to it either. And it's kind of interesting because they refer to the Gargantuas throughout the entirety of this movie as being Frankensteins, not Frankenstein monsters, nothing like that, which is funny because last week's movie, Hotel Transylvania 2, has a joke about the Frankenstein monster in that movie always just going by the name Frankenstein instead of Frankenstein's monster. However, I digress. This movie opens with a ship out at sea, and it's being attacked by a giant octopus. And the ship, the people on the ship think they're going to be saved when a giant green-haired monster rises out of the ocean and attacks the octopus. However, after the monster kills the octopus, he then destroys the ship. There's only one survivor, and he says that Frankenstein had sunk the ship. Now, this starts a big hubbub because, and this is really the only part that really connects to the previous movie. With that Frankenstein monster, when it was essentially destroyed, or the conclusion of that movie led to some scientists basically creating their own monsters with biological tissue from the Frankenstein monster. So they were creating these kind of ape-like creatures. Well, there was one that was very, very friendly to the Ross Tamblyn scientist character and his assistant named Akemi. And Akemi and the monster had kind of a special bond, and it was normal, like ape-sized. However, it eventually escaped. And after a while of not being able to find it, the Tamblyn character and all of the scientists that he works with just presumed that the creature ended up dying. And it's also important to note that their Frankenstein, as they called it, is brown-haired, not green-haired. They only created the one. They didn't, they would have created more if they had some reason to, I assume, but they only created the one. And they are pretty sure that this thing that attacked the ship is not theirs. Well, they end up seeing that this monster ends up attacking cities, but they also discover that this creature is light sensitive. So particularly if it's cloudy or if it's nighttime, the monster will come out and attack, but the moment that it is hit with any kind of bright light, it retreats, and it lives pretty much in the water, which is another clue that this was not Russ Tamblyn's Frankenstein, because that creature wouldn't live very long in the water. It would only be able to stay in the water however long a human can, assuming that that's the case. But what they end up doing is they end up giving these monsters names. They give the green Frankenstein the name Gyra, and they give the brown one the name Sanda. And we find out throughout the course of the movie that Gyra is particularly aggressive towards humans, whereas Sanda is particularly kind and protective of humans. But the army basically just has to kind of deal with this situation, and they bring out these lasers, which is something that we will see pretty much from this point forward in kaiju and Godzilla movies. And this is I don't know if this is the very first time these were used, but they are typically go by the name of masers, although in this they just call them laser guns. And it does have an effect when they use it against Gyra, and it even causes him to bleed a little bit. Godzilla, a lot of the other creatures, they just kind of plow through the masers, but the Gargantuas are vulnerable to them. So as they basically have Gyra on the doorstep of death with the use of the masers, Sanda comes in and basically helps defend Gyra and ends up leaving with him, and basically is able to basically force the army to stop. Now the army knows for sure that they have two Gargantuas that they have to go up against, and but there's like this kind of kinship. However, Russ Tamblyn has to figure out the idea that, wait a minute, we didn't create two, there's no way for them to reproduce, so they come up with this kind of harebrained scheme, or this idea of how the green Frankenstein was created. And basically it was, well, I don't know, Sanda must have scratched himself somewhere along the way on a rock, and it got into the ocean, and it went out to sea, and it survived on plankton, and basically regenerated itself into this seafaring offshoot of the Sanda Frankenstein. I don't know exactly how any of that works. Everybody thinks that's a good enough excuse for them, and they kind of go with it. Well, Sanda is trying to help his quote-unquote brother when he suddenly discovers that, he finds tattered remains of human clothing. And he realizes, because he is not stupid, that his brother is indeed feeding on the people that he himself protects. This essentially starts the War of the Gargantuas. And while Russ Tamblyn and Akemi are basically rushing to do whatever they can to save Sanda, Gyra, after getting beaten with a tree for a little bit, runs off, hits a town with Sanda chasing after him, and they have their final showdown in Tokyo Bay. They fall into the water, and the military basically goes after them and kind of bombs them from the air in the sea, which creates an underwater volcano to erupt, and it is said that the Gargantuas fall into that underwater volcano to never be seen again, which is true. They are never seen again. But let me get to my three things I like about this movie, because I find this to be a very, very peculiar watch. I'm a big fan of the Toho monster movies. This one's a little bit different in some ways. First and foremost, this is one of the few movies before we get into the Heisei period with some of those really, really dark Godzilla movies, in which we actually see a monster more or less directly target humans. In this case, Gyra is actually eating humans and has a bloodlust for it. He eats a lady at an airport. He attempts to eat a lounge singer. Oh my God, there's a song in this movie. I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But he attempts to eat the lounge lady. He attempts to eat Akemi before Sanda comes to her rescue. It's all of this like direct and almost personalized attacks on individual humans in this. Not just getting stomped on, not just being in a building that falls over, an actual direct attack. And it really kind of creates this more vicious idea for a mid-60s Toho movie that the Godzilla movies had kind of moved beyond pretty much by this point. By this point, Godzilla was a hero, and these monsters, you're actually, one of them you're actually seeing eating people. And that leads into my second like that I have about this movie, and that is the relationship between the monster siblings. There is this very interesting yin and yang to them that I think is where you really get into a lot of those people who admire the movie, because there is this kind of sense of a hunter and a protector. And you have one that, and it's a little bit of nurture and nature as well. The brown Frankenstein, Sanda, was nurtured by humans after being created. Whereas Gyra, his nature is to be a monster. He lives in the sea. He attacks things. He doesn't know what human boats are. He's kind of curious about these little humans that look like they're about the size of a gummy bear to him, so he eats them. He is truly a beast. Whereas the other is nurtured to be a good guy, to be a hero almost, as this movie plays out. It is also interesting that the two monsters don't really fight each other for very long. You think that once Sanda figures out what's going on with the eating of the humans and everything, that he is ready to like really throw down and beat up Gyra, but he is constantly trying to get Gyra to calm down, and basically in silent grunts and gestures basically say, hey man, let's talk this out. I don't want you to get hurt. I don't want you to be attacked, and I don't want to attack you. Meanwhile, the Gyra is constantly backing up and is almost afraid of Sanda, because Sanda got really, really vicious and did something that he didn't expect for something that looked and acted like him to do to him. So there is this kind of really interesting body language as they're kind of going through Tokyo before they actually have to really, really fight and fall into Tokyo Bay. It's something that I think is a lot of really good, almost silent movie technique acting going on here with the two people dressed up as the Gargantuas. Thirdly, I can understand why this is a cult classic, because this is kind of one of those situations where this is almost a perfectly bad, good bad movie. This is a movie that kind of has all of those hallmarks of the Japanese, of the things that people make fun of Japanese import movies, particularly monster movies. It's got bad effects. It's got a horrific song that is sung by the lounge singer that almost gets eaten by Gyra, who, it is terrible, and this woman is really bad at singing it too. It's very pitchy and very weird, but it's in there because a lot of the later Godzilla movies in the early 70s basically stopped for musical interludes for some reason or another. It does that. It has day for night shooting in some situations. It's got bad dialogue. And on top of that, it has the really bad overdub. Ross Tamblin's overdubbing makes him sound so like heroic, and I'm a man and I know best and this is what we do here. It's very much that kind of stilted conversation speak, and the tone of the voice is very stilted, but at the same time it's like he's an English speaking guy. His overdubbing doesn't make any sense. Some of the other Japanese characters, well, that makes sense, but it doesn't sound right, and it doesn't really match up very well with their mouth movements. It's just that kind of very classic bad movie, but it is a lot of fun, and there are some hidden kind of diamonds in the rough in this movie. Like I said, the relationship between the two Frankenstein creatures is really fascinating and plays out very, very well. The actors in those suits are doing a really, really good job of posturing it and being almost like silent movie era actors. So I get why this is a pretty big deal when it comes to cult classics and why people really kind of gravitate towards it. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Now, don't forget to check out new episodes of Monster Mondays each and every Monday afternoon. And on Wednesday mornings, you can check out new installments of Film Seizure. And both of those things are found at filmseizure.com. You can also find those episodes in places where we have our show, like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Audible, Spotify. Additionally, you can hop on over to Facebook and Twitter, and you can follow us there by searching for Film Seizure. Hey, and while you're at it, head on over to my website, www.bmovieenema.com. You can read new text reviews each and every Friday morning. And you can also follow B Movie Enema on Facebook and Twitter by searching for just that. And, hey, go on over to YouTube. Not only does Film Seizure have a channel on YouTube where we also upload all the episodes, but B Movie Enema also has a YouTube channel that you can subscribe to, and you can find episodes of my movie hosting show where I host an entire movie. It's called B Movie Enema, the series, and you can be prepared for season number 2, which is starting in September. So between going to YouTube and subscribing to the channel there or following on Facebook and Twitter, you can always stay up to date with whatever's going on with B Movie Enema. You can also do the same thing to stay up to date with Film Seizure and all the goodness that we do there. But until next week, stay spooky.